Now we're going to get to Pichu. At this point in time, second generation was out for like a year. And I think in Japan it might have been out for 2 years. I don't know. I think in Japan it came out earlier, so I don't know when in Japan it came out. Probably 99 or something, or early 2000. And then everywhere else practically got it in 2000. But because the most recent generation at the time was the second generation, they felt like including a second generation Pokemon. The reason why they include Pichu, because at that time, I think he was probably one of the more popular Pokemon of Generation 2, and he kind of had that same popularity that was pulled over from Pikachu from Generation 1. They kind of like, you know what? Pikachu was this popular, and Pichu seems to be this popular. I assume based off his popularity, he was kind of probably one of the most popular Generation 2 Pokemon I could have pulled from. I don't think he was maybe that good of an inclusion for the generation, but he has his pluses and minuses. He basically has his pros and cons, and basically he was there because of his popularity. And outside of video games at that time, the Pokemon the third movie, the one with Entei, was out by that time, and that little short beforehand, the Pikachu and Pichu adventure, kind of showed that they include him in a part of the video because of his popularity. So Pichu got in because of the fact that they needed a Generation 2 Pokemon at the time, because the Game Boy Color brought Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and they kind of include him because of his popularity, I think, based off of Pikachu, I think. Because I think he got that popularity because of Pikachu. Now when it comes to Mewtwo, and the other new Pokemon character that they added to Melee, the reason why Mewtwo was added at this time for this game was because first generation was still around. There was the Pokemon Stadium games 1 and 2 on the Nintendo 64. There was Pokemon Snap. There was Pokemon Puzzle League. There was Hey You Pikachu, and also because Generation 1 was still around, because you could transfer your Pokemon from Red, Blue, and Yellow to Gold, Silver, and Crystal. You could trade them in there. You can put the Pokemon from Generation 1 into your Generation 2 Pokemon games. So Generation 1 was still relevant at the time, even though the games were from the original Game Boy and not the Game Boy Color. They were still relevant at the time because of that, and because of the Nintendo 64 games from Pokemon that came out at the time. And outside of that, Mewtwo was one of the characters, because he was basically one of Pokemon's original legendary Pokemon. Like in Generation 1, alongside Moltres, Articuno, and Zapdos. And alongside Mew. He was number 150. And he was like, before they had those special events for Mew, Mewtwo was like the biggest Pokemon you can get in Generation 1. And since it was still relevant at the time, and since how popular he was, a character, he was included. And on top of that, he had a movie, the first movie that was ever based off of Pokemon, released about 2 years earlier, that was based off of him. See, that was the reason why. He had a movie about himself because he was so popular, because of the games, because he was one of the biggest Pokemon you can catch in the original generation, which was still around at the time. And there you go. Now we're going to get on to Ganondorf. Just like I talked about Peach and Bowser in Generation... Peach and Bowser for the Mario series, and the reason why they were included in Melee, that was one of the reasons why Gandalf was included too. He's been a mainstay Zelda character since practically the original. Mostly every Zelda game has him as a villain, or they reference him in some way. There's only a very few games that did not include him. He's a villain to the series, so they were trying to add villains to the series, and since Zelda is one of their biggest franchises, they felt like Zelda was one of the series that needed a villain, and Gandalf was basically a shoo-in. Gandalf was like so high on the list because he could have been included since day one with the original game, but because of the limitations, like I said, they didn't include him. And he's been such a mainstay in the series, he was there. And also because recently at the time, and the reason why he was Ocarina of Time, why all the Zelda characters besides, the other Link, were their Ocarina of Time selves, was because at that recently at the time, Ocarina of Time was still one of the newest Zelda games. So that's the reason why the characters had their Ocarina of Time models. And basically, that's the reason why Gandalf was included, was because of that reason. Because he was a mainstay Zelda villain, and because of Ocarina of Time being like one of the recent games, still. And this all goes down. Next be talking about Zelda. She's been a mainstay Zelda character in practically every game, and she's the franchise is named after her. So she was bound to be included in this series in Smash Bros. Eventually, because the series is named after her. She has such a big impact in the game, such a big role in the games, and she was Ocarina of Time self, because Ocarina of Time was the recent one that came out, and she was based off Ocarina of Time. That's where they pulled her from. That was basically the game they got the Zelda character from, and the reason why they included her, on top of the fact that she's a mainstay character in the series, just like Ganondorf. And then, the next character we get to would be Young Link. Now, Young Link was included because of Majora's Mask, which at that time was the most recent console Zelda game. And they wanted to include him because they wanted to represent that game. And they couldn't use Adult Link because in that game, Link never becomes an adult except when he uses the first Deity's mask. But that's not the same thing. That's like a magic spell, and it's just a mask thing. It's not an actual adult Link in the game, so they couldn't really represent Majora's Mask with adult Link because he was never an adult in that game to begin with. So they had to add Young Link because of Majora's Mask, which was a pretty popular Zelda game, and they wanted to represent that too. What better way than adding a younger Link, which also, if you really think about it, represents a lot of the older Links as well, because majority of the Links in the games are some young preteen or young kid. So it's kind of like, in a way, besides representing Majora's Mask, that it's representing the older Links too, because most of them are around that age, or a little bit older. So it's kind of like representing the older Links in a way too. But the main reason was because Majora's Mask was the most recent game at the time, and he was the best inclusion to do that. Now we're going to get to the Ice Climbers. Now, this was around the time when they wanted to start adding retro characters to the Smash Bros. Games. Characters that represent older Nintendo, or some older Nintendo. Ice Climbers were added because of that mainstay, because they were retro characters, and because Sakurai wanted to represent the NES, which was when we saw the Ice Climbers. They were an NES game. Basically, they were added because of that retro reason, because they wanted to bring in older characters, and it was to represent the NES, which I've seen that online. That's kind of the reason why, because he wanted to represent the NES, so that they were there to represent the NES at the time, because the original Smash Bros. Didn't really represent the NES outside the fact that characters that were there were on the Super Nintendo, Game Boy original, and the N64, at the time. Their franchise continued on. On the other hand, Ice Climbers didn't. So this was to represent a character that was exclusively an NES character, and it was the retro reason. They added it because, first and foremost, it was a retro character, and they can, when it comes to a retro character, they can go anywhere. They don't have to abide by recent systems, like the previous generation systems, or they can go back further, and that's the whole point of retro, is that they want to pull out something from old Nintendo history and put it back into like the mainstream, put it back into current day, so people can learn about them. And the reason why was to pull out Ice Climbers to represent the NES and show off the franchise. And I think I also heard that Sakurai actually likes the Ice Climbers characters, so that could be a minor reason as well, like for why they were included. Then we get on to Mr. Game & Watch, which was also included as a retro character because he wanted to include another retro character time. They didn't want to just make it, Ice Climbers. They wanted to add at least another retro character, and he was added because of wanting to represent old Nintendo history, aka why he's a retro character. And the reason why they wanted to use him as a retro character is because Mr. Game & Watch represents the original Nintendo handhelds. Those little Game & Watch games, the systems that came before the Game Boy, the little Game & Watch handheld things. He represents them because his games were what named those systems, named those games. And he was the star of that time because of those things. Those were the original Nintendo handhelds, the little Game & Watches. And he also got a collection or two on the Game Boy original as well that played his older games. And that's the main reason why Game & Watch was there. Outside of just being, he was a retro character there to bring in old retro Nintendo history because of the Game & Watches. The handheld before the Game Boy. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about both Fire Emblem characters at once, just like I did with Pokemon in the original video. I'm going to talk about both Roy and Marth in this part right here. Now, at this time, Fire Emblem was yet to be localized anywhere else. It was Japan exclusive. And these characters were originally planned to be only in the Japanese version of Melee. But there was they got in because, from what I heard, gamers were actually speaking their mind and actually wanting these characters to be in their version, so thus it was in the American, European, and Australian versions, even though Fire Emblem at that time was nowhere else but Japan. And the reason why Roy was included was because his game was recently coming out, thus the reason why Game Boy Advance was one of the systems they picked from, because at that time his game, Fire Emblem 6, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced it, so if anyone can help me here and maybe help how I pronounce this and correct me, please do so. Fire Emblem Fuen no Tsurugi, basically Fire Emblem 6, the one on the Game Boy Advance, the one before when it started getting localized, was the game that was recently coming out. Either it already has come out or it was coming out a little bit after, and basically the reason why Roy was one of the characters included in Smash Bros. Melee was because they wanted to advertise him with that game. They wanted to advertise their own game, with his inclusion, and because a Game Boy Advance was a system that they pulled from because it was still current. The reason why, and that was because the Game Boy Advance was out for about a year, so it had time to get to be a system where they could pull characters from and include them in the game. Is the reason why. Because it's out at the time, and that was the reason why. Because they wanted to advertise. They wanted to advertise the Game Boy Advance, and they wanted to advertise his game. And since the Game Boy Advance has been out for a year, they could kind of pull a representation for that system. And Roy was that choice because of the recent Fire Emblem game. Now, when it comes to Marth, his games were on the NES and I think even Super Nintendo. His games were older games. At that time, he wasn't there. And I think the reason why Marth was included is because he's the Japanese only retro character, I think, that was included in Smash Bros. Melee. There was Mr. Game & Watch, and there was Ice Climbers, and they were universal, different regions, America, Europe, Australia, Japan, and everything. At this time, I think they include him because he was a Japanese only retro character. Because at that time, there were no games recently. So he was included because I think of the same retro reason that Mr. Game & Watch and Ice Climbers were included, because they wanted to pull out old history of Nintendo, the original Fire Emblem 1 and Fire Emblem 3. They wanted to represent that. And because he was one of the most popular Fire Emblem characters. He was the original Lord of the Fire Emblem series, so why would they not include him? If they were going to include Roy, they would have at least probably included the original, or include one of the most recent characters at the time, like Leaf or something, who also had a Game Boy Advance game, or, Game Boy Color kind of game, or NES. Super Nintendo, I mean. Like Super Nintendo or Game Boy, Color or Game Boy Advance, they could have pulled one of the more recent characters and added them alongside Roy and made two recent Fire Emblem characters. But they decide, okay, Roy's game's coming out, we're going to add Roy to represent the new generation of Fire Emblem. But then we're going to go back and grab a retro Fire Emblem character in the original Lord of Marth. So he, technically, I believe that Marth was included because he was a Japanese retro character. And he was the third retro character alongside Game & Watch and Ice Climbers, but he was also there to represent his own series in Fire Emblem. And the reason why they spoke Japanese is because they weren't localized. That would make sense even if you didn't look it up. I looked that up, but if you made sense, because why would they speak English or any other language when they never made it out at that time to other regions? That's just what I'm saying.